evening, everyone, and welcome to this online Wiener Holocaust Library event. I'm Barbara Warnock, the Senior Curator at the Wiener Holocaust Library, and I'm delighted to welcome you here tonight to what promises to be a really fascinating talk by Mike Umbach on what is Jewish photography. So a very important and interesting question to the Wiener Holocaust Library as an archive which contains a variety of photographs, both personal, professional, historical, lots of different types of photographs that you might categorize as Jewish photography. And this event tonight is being held as part of the event series for our current exhibition, There Was a Time, Jewish Family Photographs Before 1939. And this exhibition doesn't have that much longer to run, unfortunately, just till Friday. So please try and get down to London to see it before then if you haven't already. So we're based, for those of you who don't know, in Russell Square in central London. So just to say that we will have the talk and then there'll be an opportunity for a few questions which I will pose to our speakers. So you can put any questions that you have in the chat function. So without further ado, I'm just going to now introduce our speaker for tonight's event. So I'm really delighted to welcome Professor Mike Umbach here to the Wiener Holocaust Library to speak to us about this subject. So she's Professor of Modern History at the University of Nottingham and is currently seconded as Chief Academic Advisor to the UK's National Holocaust Centre and Museum. Mike directs a multidisciplinary research project on photography as political practice in National Socialism and has published widely on photography, Nazism and the Holocaust. Her recent books include Photography, Migration and Identity, A German Jewish American Story, and Private Life and Privacy in Nazi Germany. So as you can see, she's an ideal speaker for us to be hosting tonight to talk to us about this subject. So I'll hand over now to Mike. You're muted.
The screen sharing at the same time. Can everybody see this screen now? Yes.
Yes.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. It's a great honor and pleasure to be here. And thank you so much for taking the time this evening to listen. I look forward very much to your responses and questions at the end. So I want to talk about this question of what is Jewish photography. But to begin with, I'm going to ask, why does this question even matter? Now, if we're talking about Jewish history in general and Jewish history during the era of the Holocaust in particular, it is self-evident that we need to look at Jewish sources. We would never tell this story just from the point of view of others, say of Nazis commenting on the Jews. We would look at the publications of Jewish organizations, Jewish papers, newspapers. We'd look at Jewish ego documents, diaries, letters, memoirs. We'll listen to the testimony of Holocaust survivors. But unfortunately, the same habit is much less ingrained when it comes to the visual. We look at, sorry, I'm trying to move my screen. Yeah, there it is. We look at the Holocaust still overwhelmingly through the lens of perpetrator photography. The one you see here, this image, is the most reproduced Holocaust photo in the world. It's, whole books have been written about this. We currently count over 4,000 separate instances where it appears online, and that's not counting thousands of print publications. It's in most museums, it appears in TV, documentaries, and so on and so forth. But it is a perpetrator photo, a photo taken by a professional Nazi propaganda photographer who was commissioned directly by the commandant, Jürgen Stroop, who was in charge of the suppression of the Warsaw Ghetto uprising. And this photo is part of a series of photos taken of those events and hand-selected by Stroop to commemorate these events from a Nazi point of view. So, it's important evidence, but it certainly doesn't tell the whole story. So if you make an effort to look at Jewish photography that should be self-evidently important as a counterbalance and as a counterweight, but it does raise some questions of definition. What is Jewish photography? What might make a photo Jewish? Because the question of authorship is kind of complicated when it comes to photography. We have, of course, the agency of the photographer who has a particular agenda in mind, who chooses his moment, who chooses his or her frame for the image. But also, of course, we have the agency of those acting in front of the camera, posing for the camera. They too shape the meaning and significance of the photo and from whose point of view we're experiencing the story. Beyond the moment of the photo's creation, is another set of meaning-making practices at work that, shape what the image means. I'm taking my cue here from people like Elizabeth Edwards, a very important anthropologist and photo historian, who's argued that the meaning of each photo is defined by the entire sort of social life cycle of the image. So beyond the moment of its production, we also have to considering, first of all, who decided whether a photo is kept or discarded. The vast majority of photos that are taken in human history are simply thrown away. So that's the first key decision. And then how to preserve it, for example, to put it into the sort of the narrative of a photo album, or perhaps to give the photo to an archive as part of the collection. All of these affect what and how a photo communicates the story. The storytelling that surrounds the image is also crucial in giving meaning to it and enabling it to speak to us. The relationship between photography and testimony, for example, is something that I've looked at in a different context. I won't go into too much detail about that here, but it is clearly decisive. And finally, there's the question of the agency of the viewer even today, and that's one to which I will return at the very end of this talk. But let me explore some of the, especially the first two questions, initially with some examples. So here are photos which I think most people would characterize as Jewish photos. They come from the private collections, very extensive photographic collections of a German Jewish family, the Salzmans, from Berlin. They are now in an archive in Iowa. The image you see on the left is one of the earliest photos from that collection, taken on the eve of the First World War. It shows the two brothers, Salzman, in military uniform. And it was framed. It was very important to the family. It was sort of celebrated their patriotic contribution to the German war effort. Many Jews fought in it, of course, and were very proud subsequently of their veteran status. And indeed, Hans, the younger one here, lost his older brother during the First World War. It was, however, not taken by a Jewish photographer because it's taken, as you can probably guess, in a photo studio. So they made the decision to go, to pose, to wear these clothes, to stand as they're standing, but the person pressed the shutter. It's not Jewish. I think this is a nice illustration, saying that something can be part of a very emphatically Jewish photography collection and archive invested with great emotional significance, irrespective of who the specific identity of the photographer was. Now, the Salzmans arranged most of their photographs in albums. And you see an example of an album page on the right here. This is the Salzmans on holiday in the early 1930s. What is interesting here is, I think, something else that's important about photography. Private photographs like these document the lives of individuals and families as they change and are transformed by macro historical events, but they're not a sort of one-to-one representation of daily lived reality, especially in this period where taking a photo, making a photo was involved a lot of effort, it was quite expensive. Photography always captures special moments, and many photos have an aspirational quality. That doesn't make them less important or less true as sources. We just have to be very clear what it is they show. They show us the kind of lives that people want to live, or they aspire to live, or the moments that stand out for them and that they wish to be remembered. So we see here in these photos, people wearing very elegant clothes, indulging in luxurious pursuits, international travel, fashion. You get the impression of a thoroughly bourgeois family. In fact, the Salzmanns lived in a very small apartment in a fairly working class area of Berlin in Kreuzberg, but we even guess it from these photos, and that is quite characteristic of that genre. Now, something interesting happened with this photo archive, this practice of making these albums in the middle of the 1930s, as the Salzmanns, like all other German Jews, became subject to more and more repression, exclusion, persecution. And this, at first glance, the change in tone is odd. It's surprising. So the album in 1937 documents yet another holiday. This time it's a holiday to the Alps. Now, the Alps were not just a pretty natural space. The Alps were pretty central to Nazi propaganda in terms of a vision of true Germanness and the German ability to bond with blood and soil, the landscape, and draw spiritual strength from it. Hitler himself built his sort of mountain retreat, the Berghof, which effectively later becomes the headquarters of the Third Reich in the Alps and the Bavarian-Austrian border. This was much publicized, developed as a tourist resort, endlessly photographed and reproduced in the German media. So this is a kind of problematic space. And I think, and I've argued in more detail in a book I've written on this family, that this is not a coincidence. This is, in fact, if you like, a gesture of resistance, a resistance to an official culture that seeks to exclude Jews from precisely these, if you like, ideologically charged spaces of Germanness. They're using the camera to protest against the division of German culture into a Jewish and a non-Jewish version of it. You see it in lots of other clues in this album. You see it, for example, in the script. They're adopting this sort of slightly weird oldie-worldy script here. If you go back briefly, we have the cursive here in the earlier scripts, and now we have this sort of weird Germanic script. You see it in the dress codes. They dress up their younger daughter in these sort of lederhosen, a kind of folkloristic emblem of Germanness. Not very popular in Berlin. They're really Bavarian thing, but here they're clearly, it's important as a sign. Very German, feel very German. We won't let ourselves be excluded. Also interesting in this regard, there's another page from the Salzmanns. Their photograph of driving. Mobility becomes another key part of the zeitgeist in the mid-1930s. The Nazis, of course, built all the new motorways across Germany, and here the Salzmanns photographing themselves as car drivers and indeed on the Nazi-built motorways. Again, you see that Germanic font. Now, I could talk a lot more about this page, but I really just wanted to make that general point. It is interestingly right before all German Jews are forced to surrender their driving licenses. So it's very much an instance of protesting against an imminent exclusion from precisely the practice that is being celebrated in these photos. The Salzmanns also photographed their emigration. They emigrated to New York in 1939. They sailed on the Iberia, as I'm sure all of you will know. The Iberia was the last ship with Jewish refugees that reached New York via Cuba. The next ship, the St. Louis, famously was turned around, and everybody on it was sent back to Europe, most of them to their death. So the Salzmanns were lucky. They literally got out on the last boat, and that emigration journey is also part of an extensive photographic documentation. Now one could see this is the moment kind of when they give up. They try to defend their Germanness, but it didn't help, and they now have to flee. I read these photos and a very large subsequent photographic production about the trip itself and their new lives in America slightly differently. because the Salzmans, of course, are not the first German Jews, or indeed not the first Germans to emigrate across the Atlantic to the United States. And they're very conscious of this as being a sort of well-trodden path of global Germanness with which they seek to connect their story. So even when they're excluded from the territory of the German nation state, they use photography to defend their cultural Germanness, and they perpetuate that in the United States in lots of interesting ways that I don't have time to go into. The one further comment before I move on to another example I want to make here, however, is that not only is there this whole life story and their negotiation of their Jewish identity vis-a-vis their German identity that is the subject of this pictorial narration. But there's then also the recognition on the part of the family that this story is not just a private story, but one of wider historical significance. So they make the decision themselves to then give all these photo albums and accompanying documents to a public archive, the University Archives of Iowa. Iowa because the older daughter of the Salzman couple, Ruth, later meets a businessman from Iowa in New York and moves with her new husband to there. So that was where she lived. But I think that decision, that this is a story that has such a big historical significance that these private photos then need to be put into the public domain, in turn enabling me to write my book about them, is also part of that sort of storytelling and history telling through photography that contributes to the meaning of the photographs themselves in terms of their social life cycle. Before I come on to more explicit Holocaust photography, I want to talk about one more family briefly. The Meyers, like the Salzmans, they are originally from Berlin, although they do move around Germany quite a bit. Here too, the early photos show the father of the family in his First World War military uniform. He too is very proud of his veteran status. His wife, Käthe, was a teacher, especially drama teacher, and also someone who's very interested in traditions of German and European folk dancing and folklore. And she wrote a couple of books about this subject. We see her there on the top right, with teaching a group of kids to do folk dancing. So in many ways, it's a similar story, and it shows that the Salzmans were by no means an isolated example in terms of narrating their lives and both their Jewishness, but also their Germanness through extensive photography and album making practices. As you can already tell from the title of the archive, however, they ended up somewhere else. Like the Salzmans, they're forced to emigrate. They emigrated a little bit earlier in 1937, but they emigrate to what was then Mandate Palestine, to a place called Nahariya, which is now right in the north of Israel. And here they photographed the arrival of their shipping containers. You can see the inscription there on the side, Nahariya via Haifa, coming from Hamburg, which is of course the big shipping port. And just give you a little flavor of how these stories continue. So the Meyers, who were a very urban family in lots of ways, of course now find themselves in the small agricultural settlement. Nahariya at that time is tiny, and they try various different things. And one of the first things they try is chicken farming. You see her there on the left feeding the chickens. But chicken farming is a little bit of a failure. They're not very experienced. Also, the climate turns out to be not very conducive to it. So they give up and they try various other things that are more successful. They open a bicycle repair shop and whatnot. All of that is photographically documented in enormous detail as well. But one of my favorite photos is the one on the right here, where they decide to stage a cabaret performance about the failure of chicken farming, German-style chicken farming in Nahariya. So everybody's here on the cabaret stage being instructed, performing this. And the funniest thing about it is that the music, they they wrote the lyrics for the cabaret, but the lyrics were set to tunes by the German Romantic composer Schubert. So it tells you something about the portability of these German Jewish identities to very different cultural and national spaces. This archive too is one that the family later, in this case, the youngest son of the family, Andreas, who emigrated with his parents in 1937, decided to make public. And Andreas too felt that this was not just a private archive, but it was one that contained a historically important story and therefore needed to be made accessible to wider public. In this case, not just researchers by placing in an archive, but Andreas also worked very closely with the filmmaker Annette Vogtmann, and I had the great pleasure of being part of the making of that film as well, and turning this into a sort of a documentary. It's an art film that reflects on and is inspired by this photographic archive, which is being released in Israel next year. Okay, so moving on to what we might call Holocaust photography more properly, in other words, the photography of individuals and families who did not manage to escape from Nazi persecution before the outbreak of the Second World War. Now, I'm sure many of you are familiar with these photos, but I did want to say a few sentences about them because I think they are a beautiful illustration of what Jewish photography can tell us about the story, in this case, about the story of the Lodz ghetto. These are photographs by Henrik Ross, and he was only one of many people incarcerated in ghettos, but who had in his previous life been trained as a photographer and carried on his photographic practice while in the ghetto. Now, Ross and also Mandy Grossman were in the relatively advantaged position of also working as photographers for the Jewish ghetto administration, and as such had access, albeit limited access, to camera equipment and film. But both of them and others managed to squirrel away some of the film material and also take clandestine private photos of life in the ghetto, which were not part of the official briefing, which were in fact strictly forbidden. And a lot of these clandestine photos bear the marks of that forbiddenness, the impossibility really of taking these photos. So for example, photographers who were too scared of being executed on the spot if caught taking these photos by raising the camera to eye level, would cut little holes in the corner, in the pockets of their jackets and their coats, and just photograph from the hip. So a lot of the images are a little bit blurry and they're a little bit wonky. And that, I think, is incredibly important as a historical source in its own right. We always have to remember that the picture perfect shot, especially in the context of war and genocide, is nearly always the perpetrator shot. The perfect position, the perfect material is itself an expression of power. Those who are radically disempowered do not have that luxury. So rather than always looking for the good photo, we should be looking for the true photo. And this is where Jewish photography has so much to contribute and such a different story to tell. What I also particularly love about this image by Henrik Ross is the fact that the photo also bears the physical traces of the next step of its difficult meaning-making process, that is the question of preservation. Henrik Ross and many other photographers like him hid much of their photographic production for fear of discovery, and indeed in the consciousness that they might themselves not survive, but they wanted to leave these important photos behind for others to find and view one day. So the imagined future viewer is really important for them. Henrik Ross was lucky he survived, and immediately after he was liberated, he returned to the site of the Lodz ghetto and excavated the boxes that he had buried, anything really. Boxes, jam jars, these metal milk canisters and so on were used to bury photographs, film, as well as other documents in the ground. And you see him here on the right excavating a box that contains such photos. And the photo on the left bears the physical traces of that complicated history. You can see that the negative has been damaged, moisture's got in, it's eaten into the film. And I think, again, this is very, very powerful in terms of reminding us that photographs are also material witnesses of that life cycle that they have gone through. The damage is part of the photo's story. It's not a disadvantage. It adds, I think, to its power, as indeed does the visual language of the photography of Ross and others itself. He's another one of my favorite photos from the Lodz ghetto. And I think it's immediately apparent that it tells the story differently from how the Nazi propaganda photographers would have told it. Yes, the Nazi photos also show destruction of the ghetto, here the destruction of the synagogue. But in Ross's photo, it's not a sort of trophy image of a destruction. It's there's something melancholy and sad about the image, but there's also something very majestic about these ruins, and especially the way where the Star of David is placed in the photograph, which still in some ways towers over the image, and it's a reflection on Jewish identity, not a celebration of its destruction. Okay, now photography from camps is much rarer. It was almost impossible to smuggle cameras into camps, but there are some photographs taken by inmates of concentration camps. Some of you may know this image. This was a group of women, not all of whom are Jewish, some of them are Polish resistance, who had been selected to be subjects to medical experiments. And they remarkably managed to smuggle a camera into the camp from a newly arriving group, yet still on the other side of the fence before they have stripped of all their belongings. So they throw the camera over the fence, and they take a series of photographs hiding behind the barracks to show the effects of these medical experiments on their legs. You see that injury there. Why is this important? It's important as evidence. It is also, I think, important as a form of, if you like, assertion and symbolic resistance. The fact that these photos speak to a determination to believe in a future justice, that this is evidence that at this moment will have no consequence, but if it can be preserved for the future one day, it will support a process whereby the perpetrators will be held to account. And indeed, the undeveloped film did survive. One of the women survived and had it on her person at the moment of liberation. She took it with her to Paris, where she then developed the film and circulated the images. And finally, in this series, before I get to the question of the modern viewer, I wanted to say a few brief words about the really unique series. I'm sure, again, very familiar to many of those listening tonight, of the Sonderkommando photos from Auschwitz. Really the only photos we have from Auschwitz that show the actual Operation Auschwitz-Birkenau, that is, of the industrial killing machine at that camp. Now, there are, of course, perpetrator photographs of Auschwitz. There are there's a photo album made by the SS of the ramp and the selection processes at Auschwitz. But first of all, they are very much about a perpetrator perspective. They try to show everything as a very orderly operation. They try and show the kind of bureaucratic categorization of people, people as objects being sorted in that kind of orderly German manner. Lots of those pictures are taken from a kind of bird's eye perspective. The photographers are standing on top of the trains, photographing down on the people. So very much perpetrator perspective, but not one that shows the actual mass murder, because that was the one subject that really was taboo. The Nazis photographed a lot in the ghettos. They liked those ghetto photos because they thought photographing emaciated Jewish people who'd, already undergone years of maltreatment and malnourishment and had no clean clothing and so on, would rip the mask of civilization off the Jewish face. That's the phrase they always use, right? This is to show the Jews as they really are, to make their racial difference visible. But that's a very different story from the story of actual industrial mass murder, and that was not to be photographed. And 4 inmates at Auschwitz managed to defy all this. So the Sonderkommando are a group of inmates who are commandeered to help with the day-to-day cleaning operations in the camp. So in this case, they're actually cleaning the gas chambers after every use, and this photo is taken from the doorway. And so the black frame you see there is the doorway looking at the burning of bodies outside. One of the four men worked together, 3 standing guard, while the 4th was taking the pictures. There are only 4 of them. They were smuggled out in a toothpaste tube and handed over to the Polish resistance. And again, I think this speaks to a desire not only to create evidence and to counter the perpetrator gaze, but also that kind of determination to believe in a future where people will look at these photos with different eyes from the Nazis, and where these photos will help a process of holding the perpetrators to account. And that is why they are so important. Okay, now that brings me to the final section of my talk, and that is the question of how we view these photos today. It's all very good if experts, academics are publishing about Jewish photographs, but does it make a difference? And can we counter the dominance of the perpetrator photographs and indeed the Allied liberator photographs that are so prominent in the mass media and indeed in museum cultures, in school textbooks, and so on and so forth? Now, of course, liberator photos are very different, I know, from Nazi perpetrator photos, but for all their benign intentions, they too, of course, deny Jewish people any kind of agencies. They are just objects of the gaze in the liberator photos taken at the camps at the moment of liberation as well. So to explore the question of whether it is possible to sensitize a kind of lay audience to these differences and the importance of viewing Jewish photos when we talk about Jewish history, and especially Jewish history in the era of the Holocaust, my colleagues from the National Holocaust Museum and I co-curated a touring exhibition, sadly just come to an end. It just closed, I think, week before last at the Jewish Museum in London, which was the final stage of its tour, although we might have an international tour hereafter, called The Eye as Witness. And I will not talk about this exhibition in great detail, but its overall objective was to disenchant the sort of affective power of the perpetrator photography and then introduce audiences to how different the story looks if we see it through the perspective of Jewish photography and Jewish storytelling through photography, including many of the examples that you've seen in the talk today. The exhibition used a range of different media, so it wasn't just photos on display boards, it was lots of interactive screens, there was a virtual reality installation and so on. And at the very end, there was an interactive screen where we invited people to respond and in responding record their responses to photos that we were showing them. The photos we were showing them on that screen, we provided no contextual information for, because we wanted to capture people's immediate response to the visual stimulus, but they did echo photos that people have previously encountered in the exhibition. And I just want to give you a tiny snapshot of some of the data that's coming out of that. We're still crunching all the numbers at the moment. We will have a publication later that analyzes it more thoroughly. Yeah, there are a couple of graphic photos in this, which is unfortunately unavoidable. We made them quite small just as a warning. So the first graph I wanted to show you is a classic liberator photo. In this case, an American one, the liberation of Buchenwald, a pile of scantily clad and indeed naked dead bodies. And this is, of course, what a lot of liberators photographed. Some of you may remember that in the permanent Holocaust exhibition at the Imperial War Museum in London, the one that has just this year been replaced by, I think, a greatly improved new exhibition. The old exhibition ended with a huge enlargement of a British liberator photo from Bergen-Belsen, in fact, documented the cleanup operation where a British bulldozer is bulldozing a huge pile of dead bodies like this into a mass grave. I think a horrendous image of obvious documentary value, but horrible as an image. And they've blown that up to over life-size in the final room of the exhibition. The idea is always that you need to confront people with the horrors to somehow shock them into becoming better viewers and by extension better human beings. It's a tactic that is almost as old as the Holocaust. The British used these images in the re-education programs for the German population immediately after 1945. I'm not sure it's ever particularly worked, but I'm certainly not sure that it works terribly well now. What these images do evoke is horror, and that is what our responses show. The biggest category reaction, the term that people associated with these images when we asked them was horror. And they are horrible images, fair enough. Evidence, yes, I see that too. They are important evidence of the scale of the crimes. But what Holocaust educators always tell us, that these images lead to pity or even empathy is not evident in our findings. The scores for pity and empathy are 3% each. And this contrasts very sharply with using Jewish photographs to tell the story of the Holocaust. So one example, this is also a Henrik Ross image of a deportation, a photograph of a child being deported, being prepared by his parents for the deportation as best as they could. It's a very moving image, very much not a mass of passive victims, very much emphasizing individuality. It's an emotionally subtle image. And the kinds of questions that people asked when confronted with this image, and as I said, we didn't explain the context or who took it, are very much more, I think, the sort of questions that we would hope a modern viewer looking at Jewish photography would ask. So they're seeing the person. They're asking, who was this person? And was this person killed by the Nazis or did they survive? So those questions, in a sense, that speak to that sense of empathy are much more prominent here. Another type of photo, which I think elicited really interesting questions, one that on the surface didn't seem to have anything to do with the Holocaust. It's a very touching photo from the collections of the National Holocaust Center. It shows 3 Holocaust survivors, Bob Norton, who was sent by his parents from Germany on the Kindertransport to Britain, but highly unusually, his parents then managed to obtain visas to emigrate to Britain as well. And the first thing they did when the family was reunited happily in the UK is they sprinted off to a Woolworths self-service photo booth and took this photo to commemorate their happy reunion. They put on the best clothes they could get, probably borrowed from other people, and they're posing for this photo. And I think it's wonderfully powerful in that, you know, again, it's not, there's no Jewish photographer, it's a self-service photo booth, but it's very much a Jewish photo, right? It's because the agency is with the people who take it and the story that they want to tell through it. And also, I think a photograph that, if you know the backstory, that reminds us of how many millions of similar photos like this should have existed and don't. Okay, I will finish here and I look forward to any questions you might have. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Mike, and that was really fascinating. And it's great to hear from you. And I think those in the audience who have seen the exhibition will see its kind of enormous relevance for our current exhibition. So yes, if anyone in the audience has a question, then please just post them in the chat. So I'll sort of kick things off. In your talk, you focused very much on which obviously makes complete sense in terms of our exhibition and being a Holocaust library, but you focus very much on the German story and the wartime and the Holocaust, and thinking about what is Jewish photography in that context. I wonder if you could say whether you think there's kind of a distinct category of Jewish photography in other contexts as well.
Yes, and one of the reasons why it's so hard to make comparisons is that, really, to answer the question fully, of course, one would need to be an expert in the visual culture and the photographic practice in all those 22 countries where Jewish communities were subjected to persecution culminating in the Holocaust, which is quite a tall ask. So, you know, my background is much more German Jewish history, so that's where I feel most confident about being able to decipher the sometimes very overt, but often quite subtle visual clues by which people inscribe themselves into that culture, or indeed express their distance from it. I've also spent a lot of time working on non-Jewish German photography, which enables me to see the similarities and differences, which I think is a really key part of the story, right? Visually, how can we tell what is Jewish if we don't compare it to the other? But there are now, photography, of course, is less strictly nationally bounded than other media of expression, at least because it doesn't rely on language. So there's a easier circulation of photographs, also in print media and so on, from the much less substantive body of Polish Jewish photographs that I have also looked at. I would say that there are definitely similarities. So this is not a uniquely German story. What is certainly true is that more generally camera ownership in Germany was much more widespread in this period than almost anywhere else in the world. The US is a close second. England is lagging far behind. Eastern and Central Europe are lagging even further behind. So in other countries, there aren't quite as many of the private photographs. They certainly exist, but not quite as many individuals and families had the opportunity to take photographs. So many. Having said that, we mustn't confuse camera ownership with photographic practice. We know that cameras get swapped around in communities, in friendship groups, in families. So, you know, each camera will be used by 10, 20, 30 people. So lots of people who don't own a camera take photos, but also, of course, are in photos. And I know of lots of families who made photo albums, even though they didn't have a camera, but other people photographed them, they asked for prints and so on. So it's definitely not a uniquely German practice. Some of the Polish Jewish photos I've seen are relatively similar, except of course they do then reference other symbols of national identity. So say on the deaths of Pilsudski in Poland, Jewish people participating in building the memorial mound for Pilsudski, whom, in spite of his rather unpleasant politics, they saw as a relative break on the virulent anti-Semitism of Polish society before the German occupation. Right? So it's a way of saying, yes, we're participating in a patriotic ritual, but we're also trying to celebrate and commemorate here a facet of Polish culture that is less anti-Semitic than other varieties thereof in that period.
Thank you. And yeah, it'd be interesting actually to hear then more about the differences you've mentioned. So between say Jewish or Jewish German or Polish Jewish photography and that of non-Jews.
Okay. Well, thank you to Elaine, who said she's looking at her family's photos in a different way. Now, I've encountered this reaction sometimes, and I do hope that that would be a wonderful outcome. I remember giving a talk a while ago in a synagogue about some of the cases I spoke about today, the Salzman family and so on. And some people came up to me afterwards and said, I have very similar photos in the attic from my family, and they were not just German Jews, or Jews from, all over, lots of Jews from Poland, from Czechoslovakia and so on. And they said, we never thought that they were really historical documents, especially not of the Holocaust, because we're so conditioned to see the Holocaust in terms of these iconic pictures that I was talking about at the beginning. And I think it's a really it's a problem that we've all been so conditioned to think that the only photos that adequately represent the Holocaust are the piles of dead bodies, or the Nazi photos of the ghettos. And it's so important to recognize that these small photos, small in the sense that they tell in very individual stories that celebrate identity and love and resilience and indeed spiritual resistance to the dictates of Nazism are a really important part of that story and deserve to be seen and deserve to be celebrated. And if anybody would like to contact me to look at some more photos, I'd be delighted.
Yes, and a question for Deborah, which is about, do you have any suggestions for what type and make of camera a teenage boy in 1930s Germany might have had? And I assume Deborah's referring to someone specific. She says he was an avid photographer. Yeah,
so all of this is dependent on the invention of the small handheld camera, right, where you just have to press the button. Before that, cameras on tripods, it's really complicated, they're really expensive, you need to sit really still for the image. So the shorter shutter speeds, the lightness of the camera, essentially just pressing the button means you don't need specialist training to take them. The Leica is the kind of prototype that's patented in Germany in 1925, I seem to remember. But very quickly, a whole host of other cheaper versions of the same kind of camera appear on the market. There are hundreds of different brands already in the early 1930s, which are, funnily enough, sometimes advertised as Kinderkameras, so cameras for children. That doesn't mean they're actually intended for children. They're so easy to use that a child could use them. That's the advertising idea. So people who had resources would buy the Leica. That was seen as the gold standard. But there are many sort of cheaper and slightly simpler imitations on the market in the 1930s that people use. So it's difficult to tell. There are, and there are different film formats and so on. You can sometimes tell from the actual picture, in terms of the aspect ratio, what exact type they're using, but there isn't a singular answer to it.
Thank you. So Fabian is asking whether you looked at Jewish photography from after 1945 and whether these photographs perhaps show a different kind of self-presentation.
Yes, I have in some cases, and I hope to do much more. my longer term hope is to do a kind of project on Jewish photography and the Jewish diaspora after 1945, and to do more sort of systematic comparisons between people who went to Eretz Israel and people who went to, say, South America, and people who went to South Africa, people who went to Shanghai. Shanghai was a big thing during the Second World War. It's one of the few places you get into without a visa. As well as the more familiar stories in terms of, you know, England and the US and so on and so forth. So I haven't done a systematic comparison yet. It's a big undertaking, will require more than one person. But I have looked in some instances, like the Meyer family I mentioned, and I've also, of course, with the Salzmans, I've looked at what they then do in the United States. It's actually hilarious. The 1937 album in particular that I mentioned earlier, and it's where they're really defending their belonging to German culture, and they photograph themselves in front of all these German sites. Big one are German cathedrals, right? The Gothic is meant to be the Germanic style. So there they are in front of Cologne Cathedral, in front of Bamberg Cathedral. You always pose in front of the cathedral. If they possibly can, they drive their car in front of the cathedral and have that in the picture too. And natural sites, national monuments, they go to the city of Nuremberg, you know, which is eerily also, of course, the city of the Nazi Party rallies, very big in terms of the birthplace of Dürer, the kind of big German Renaissance artist, much reproduced during this period, etc., etc. Then they're in the United States in the 1950s. They managed to get a new car. What do? They go on a driving holiday and they pose in front of the American sites. So here we are in front of the Statue of Liberty. Here we are in front of Monticello, Jefferson's home, and here we are in front of the Grand Canyon and whatnot. The way of posing, the driving, the posing by the side of the highway, the posing in front of the National Monument, all very, very similar. So there's a sort of photographic habitus and a way of posing that they very much take with them. So the symbols are now about belonging in America, but the way of picturing that new sense of belonging owes a lot to the practices they learned in Germany. So these are quite mobile things. Having said that, I think it's easy to forget how many Jewish people did not end up in big cities. So, if you're looking at Latin America, lots of people wanted to go to Buenos Aires, not least because it looks and feels quite European. But of course, that border was closed relatively early. The border to Bolivia remained open much longer. People didn't particularly want to go to Bolivia, which wasn't very kind of glitzy and modern, and lots of people ended up in fairly small rural communities. So there you then have a much bigger break, because the environment that they now need to relate to through the pictures is so very different. That's more like the Maya story that I was talking about in Nahariya in Israel. Right? The idea of how do we make the camera useful in mapping our belonging to this new homeland when the homeland looks like a desert. The Yekes Museum in Israel, the Yekes being the German Jews emigrated to Israel, had as its sort of cover image, it's sadly closed now, but the collections have been transferred to Haifa University. But the Yekes Museum had its sort of iconic cover image, a picture of a German Jewish person, so a Yeke, standing in this sort of rocky, sort of semi-desert. There's nothing to see except rocks and a few bushels of grass, but he's wearing a three-piece tweed suit and he's holding a briefcase. He's got a little cap on. And that's what sort of shaped the nickname Yekes, because they always wear the jackets. That is actually Mr. Meyer from the Meyer family I was talking about. So there's sometimes sort of, interesting ironies that emerge if you transfer a kind of fairly cosmopolitan, metropolitan habitus into these more kind of agricultural settings. Anyway, I see lots more questions. I'll shut up so we can squeeze in a couple more.
So a question from Caroline about whether your exhibition has any photographs by Jewish partisan groups.
Our exhibition didn't. They do exist. They're relatively rare. Obviously, if you're engaged in partisan warfare, you're not likely to run around with a camera. There are some relatively posed group portraits of Jewish partisans, mostly fighting as part of the Soviet armies. So, you know, there were cameras around, so they took some group photographs, and they are certainly in museums in Israel. They play a fairly prominent role in Yad Vashem. Also, just last week was at the Ghetto Fighters Museum near Nahariya, where they have similar photos on display as well. They are very rarely seen in the UK for reasons about which we could go on a lot, but it's, I guess, generally to do with a way of viewing Jewish people as, you know, this sort of huge mass of victims, this, you know, where we've not only edited out the individuality of the stories, but also these different forms of resistance, the symbolic resistance I was talking about, but also, of course, the armed resistance.
Yeah, and Caroline, I'm sure you're aware of this, but we did feature a couple of those photographs in our Jewish resistance exhibition, which is available online. So Mark is asking how you found the Zaltzman family. I mean, I think you said it was in an archive, was it in Iowa? But I don't know whether, you know, was it just a general search or did someone tip you off? Or
coincidence, I was in Iowa for a completely different reason, and I spoke to the archivists, and they're very helpful and pointed me to this amazing collection. This is another, but by its very nature, these photos are very globally dispersed. People took them with them. If you remember the emigration photos, I showed both of the Zaltzman family and the Meyer family, and that was their different destinations. And you see those crates there, and they have the photo albums in them. You know, every time I look at that photo, no, the archive is there, it's there. I'm so thankful that that didn't get stolen, because of course so much Jewish property got stolen by the authorities before people could emigrate with these shipping containers. And indeed the Zaltzmans lost half their stuff. The smaller boxes survived, but the big shipping container was lost. Stolen by the Nazis. But if people possibly could, they took their photo albums with them. Nobody leaves the photo albums behind. But it means that they've ended up, and people emigrated and fled, both before the Holocaust and indeed people who left Europe in the immediate aftermath of the Holocaust. You know, they're in the destination countries all over the world. So I suspect there is a lot more than even I'm aware of at this moment in some places I mentioned, South Africa and Australia and Argentina and Bolivia, etc., etc. So it exists, but it's a very dispersed archive. And sorry, one more thing on that. Very often these are multiple migrations. People don't just go from A to B, right? So first of all, lots of German Jews leave Germany, but not to what turn out to be safe countries in long run, but countries that they feel safe in the mid-1930s, like they go to Paris or they go to Prague, which has, you know, a big Jewish community and seems very welcoming. And then the Wehrmacht arrives, and then people move on. But also, as I said earlier, you can't get to Argentina anymore, so they go to Bolivia, but eventually 10 years later they manage to go on to Argentina. On this case, they go to New York, but then they go to other parts of the United States, so the next generation moves on. So it's where these archives are mirrors the history itself, and it requires a much more global perspective on research and not this kind of national boundedness. You know, you can't say, I'm a German historian, I work on German archives, and you find very little there on this topic.
Yeah, and of course the Wiener Library have got quite extensive collections of this sort of thing, but they almost always, they're not entirely, but they almost always tell stories of people, you know, who migrated as refugees to Britain, understandably, but occasionally something else as well. So we've got a few more questions. Are you happy to take a couple more?
Yes, of course, yes.
Yes, okay, great, thank you. So Claudia's asking what you think the potential of kind of increased visual literacy is in Holocaust education.
It's really, really important. We know that young people in particular are primarily visual learners. All the textbooks that we have, all the PowerPoints that teachers use in the classroom have images on them. It's just unheard of these days for anybody to use a PowerPoint slide in a classroom setting that doesn't have an image. I worry that teachers, but also producers of textbooks and so on, use them too much as illustrations. They assume that the text defines the meaning, and then, oh, and here, by the way, this is what something looked like. We know from research that young people will look at the image first. They will form an impression of what this topic is about by looking at the image. And if the image is in some way misleading or biased, that will become a filter through which all the subsequent textual information is filtered, through what the teacher is saying is filtered, and so on. So images can be really quite sort of dangerously misleading. And I think we need to make much more effort. This is not just true for the Holocaust. All media today, social media, everything is accompanied by an image. We need to teach visual literacy. Otherwise, we don't enable proper political or ethical thinking. Images can be incredibly deceptive, and touched on some of these things. The good image is the image taken from a position of power. We need to teach people that, just as we teach them in school that to read a text critically, we need to teach people to read images critically. Otherwise, we're putting this whole project of Holocaust education in peril. I could go on, but I will leave it there.
Yes, thank you. And Janice is asking if you could comment on the impact of the Sonderkommando photographs from Auschwitz.
Well, they've been subject to French philosopher, I guess, characterized as Georges Didi Übermann wrote a very famous book about them. So they have been the subject of scholarly debate. I'm not sure they have had such an impact on a general sort of mass audience. And again, it's that, they're really blurry. The one I showed you is the relatively clearest one. Two of them are showing women who are, stripped naked and being driven towards the gas chamber through the forest. You barely see anything. And one of them, you just about, if you look closely, make out some running figures at the bottom. The other one is just kind of trees and chaos. They're very powerful, but they are very much the opposite of what we think of as a photo that illustrates a historical event. They're really hard to read. They really show that incredible risk that people took to take them in a situation where this was virtually impossible. So I don't, they don't fit into our sort of modern media expectations of what a photo should look like. So I worry that they haven't had nearly enough of an impact on the general public. In scholarship, they have been much debated, and I think been the starting point for really important, a whole wave of scholarship that thinks much more carefully about photography as a source than we used to.
Yes, thank you. And just a final question, whether you think that documentaries that use archival footage filmed by perpetrators should kind of label it as such, because I think so often it's, the Nazis are mentioned and then there's some kind of shorthand for the Nazis in the form of a Leni Riefenstahl film or whatever it is. So do you feel that there is a responsibility on the filmmakers to kind of draw attention to what their images are?
Yeah, what an excellent idea. I think we absolutely should. And we absolutely have to continue using this material. Often it's the only material we have, and of course even more so with moving images. There's no counter filmmaking private filmmaking in this period. That was incredible. Almost, I say that there's none. There is some actually. I found some private home movies. A friend pointed them out in an archive in Vienna, which include a Jewish family who made a fascinating, very short, just a few minutes, material is really, really expensive, but a movie about how their villa outside Vienna was being Aryanized. And they sort of slightly turned the table on the Nazis by sort of turning into sort of mock ceremony where they've all dressed up and the children have made this little basket in which they present the Nazis with the keys to their house as if it's sort of, a gift from them, and they turn this all into film. It's very, very eerie. But it's one of the very few examples that I can think of privately, sort of Jewish home movies that have that document these events. But you're absolutely right. I think it should be made perfectly clear what is Nazi photography. Now, of course, it's a slightly blurry category. Most of the footage, as indeed some of the most iconic photos I've showed, are done by the PK. That's the propaganda company. So they are professional propaganda artists, photographers, filmmakers who are embedded in the German armed forces. Before that, during civilian times, you mentioned Riefenstahl and so on. But there's, of course, also an awful lot of private hobbyist perpetrator photography. The ghettos were really popular, so it sounds horrible to say, but as a kind of outing for members of the Wehrmacht on their time off, weekends, whatever, went to the ghetto to photograph starving and dying Jewish people on the streets. So we also have, perpetrator photos, not by professional propaganda photographers, but by implicated and guilty private individuals who somehow find it amusing to photograph these scenes. And that needs to be made very clear too. And it isn't in our textbooks, and it isn't in most of our museums. We have started doing it, and surprisingly, after all I've been saying, at the National Holocaust Museum, but I think one of the first to try and make that very, very explicit. You're looking at this, it's evidence, but it's how the Nazis wanted to portray it.
Thank you. And I think that's a very important point to end on. So thank you so much to Professor Imbach, and thank you very much to the audience and for all of you that posed questions. And we hope to see you again at future library events. And if you'd like to see our exhibition on Jewish family photography before 1939, then you have until Friday, so please try and make it along. Okay, thanks everyone, and good night.
Thank you so much, everyone. Really appreciate it. Thank you.